And welcome to the Twilight talk, a Twilight zone. There is an app for everything, so I checked on an app called Sun and Moon. When is a sunset today? And it's 10:15. And the twilight is about 1 hour after the sunset. So brace yourself, we're going to be locked here until 11 p.m. I do not intend to introduce the gentlemen we have here at length because they're very well known and their CVs are extensive CVs are on the CyCon webpage. Just want to say that Herb Lin is one of the best researchers there is in the world concerning cyber, and General Petraeus is one of the best generals there is in the world. Both are formidable intellectuals, so it's going to be a treat. And we will start this session with Herb, who has prepared some points for us to kick off the session. So Herb, please, floor is yours.
Okay. So, am I?
It is.
Okay, thank you. So I'm delighted to be here at CyCon again. Thank you for having me and indulging me. What I wanted to talk about was the difference and similarities between cyber operations and cyber-enabled information operations. Now, there is a tendency these days to lump everything under the cyber label. And I think that that's a mistake because solutions for one don't necessarily cross over to solutions for the other. At the same time, there's some insight to be had by drawing the similarities, and understanding some of the differences. So let me start with this, which is Russian interference in the US election in 2016 as an act of cyber war. Okay. Many people asserted that this was an act of cyber war against the United States. Okay. Dick Cheney, Hillary Clinton, a variety of people. I mean, it's not often that you get Hillary Clinton and Dick Cheney to agree on something, but here they agree. Okay. And I want to point out that there's a big difference between cybersecurity, thinking about cybersecurity, and defending against cyber-enabled information operations. Okay. Well, if you think about cyber war and cyber conflict, they target entities in cyberspace. You're able to prosecute it because of flaws in the technology that you're attacking. That is, flaws of design, flaws of implementation, and so on. By contrast, cyber-enabled information operations uses information to target not computers but human minds, right? So adversaries prosecute I/O by taking advantage of the technical virtues of IT. That is, the Russians used Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and so on exactly as they were intended to be used. Right? No zero-day vulnerabilities there. Okay? At least not in the usual sense that we understand the term. They used Twitter, they used Facebook, they benefited from the algorithms that the social media platforms developed to increase user engagement with advertisers and user-generated content, right? That's exactly that's what YouTube and that's what they're for. Okay. If you look at the official U.S. government, official U.S. government definition of cybersecurity, it's found in NSPD 54, National Security Directive 54. Cybersecurity is the prevention of damage to, protection of, restoration of computers, electronic systems, and so on. Okay. The target, computers, right? Information operations, they are deliberate use of information to confuse, mislead, affect the choices of the adversary. That the target is minds, right? The head. Okay. There are some commonalities between them, and of course now the screen is too far away, so I can't read it. So I'm going to stand up. I apologize here. Okay. Both of them depend on deception. Okay. Cyber operations, they depend on the ability to deceive you into clicking on a link, right? Nobody sends you an email that says, click here and I'll fry your hard disk. Nobody says that, right? There's a deception in there. Information operations depend on deceptive content, inauthentic attribution. Economic incentives reduce attention to cybersecurity. Right? You don't care about it enough. You don't pay enough attention to cybersecurity. It's too expensive to use. Okay. There are economic incentives to exploit cognitive limitations and to increase the time on platform. Right? Facebook has incentives to keep people on their platform as long as possible, and so they are exposed potentially to adversary information operations constantly. There are vulnerabilities in software. There are vulnerabilities in the human mind, what we call biases and cognitive biases that change the way we perceive the world. Both brains and computers both have limitations, bandwidth, memory, and the like. Convenience works against cybersecurity. And what the psychologists call cognitive economy works against analytical thinking. Right? You only have a certain amount of cognitive resources, and you can spend them here or there, and when you're out of it, you have to wait until they're replenished, or else you just fall back on your old intuitive thinking. You don't think things through very well. You make much worse decisions when you're hungry or sleepy, for example. For cyber, the great connectivity and integration of information technology, they are strengths, right? But they also turn into vulnerabilities in cyberspace. The First Amendment and commitments to truth. I'm from the United States. Those are really important to me, right? Skepticism. Those have been weaponized against us. Okay, those strengths have been turned into vulnerabilities. Okay. For both of these, there's a diffuse locus of response in the U.S. government. Nobody's in charge of this stuff, neither for cyber. I mean, 37 agencies, well, no, dozens of agencies in the United States have something to do with cybersecurity, and there's nobody responsible for thinking about I/O. They both require not just a whole of government response, but a whole of society response. It's hard enough to get a whole of government response. Think about what it means to mobilize a whole society to respond. They both require that. The target space is not under government control. That's a good thing, right? But it's a problem. Right? Private sector owns lots of cyberspace, but the private sector, people, individuals, you own your own minds, and all the people out there own their own minds. I don't want them under government control. But that's a problem in terms of developing a response. And in both cases, borders are ineffective. And here's some similarities. You think about it. You have to think about the battle space. What's the battle space in cyber? Well, it's cyberspace, right? The information environment is the corresponding construct for information operations. And note that it contains cyberspace in it. The other part of it, that's the physical and informational. Then there's the cognitive part of it, the cognitive dimension of the information environment. That is how people think about stuff. You can talk about cyber capabilities, offensive cyber capabilities in terms of gaining access, software, hardware vulnerabilities, and payloads. You can think of psychological operations as requiring access to the users, to people, taking advantage of their cognitive vulnerabilities, and using tailored content to exploit those cognitive vulnerabilities. Think about the different kinds of impact that you might have by targeting information technology, the usual confidentiality, integrity, availability. There's impacts on humans, too. You can use I/O to inform, to persuade, to distract, to obfuscate, to mislead, provoke, confuse, and the like. Okay. You can think about viruses propagating in cyberspace. Okay, viruses and worms as ways of conducting attack. Here, network segmentation helps because it stops a virus from going from one place to another. In the information environment, you talk about messages going viral. The content of those messages can be good or bad. Okay? And there, community segmentation hurts your situational awareness. Okay? So that's a difference. Okay? The nature of the intelligence required. Both are heavily dependent on good intelligence, but I would argue that cyberspace is really dependent on good tactical intelligence. And it's mostly classified, it's mostly hard to obtain. By contrast, understanding the intelligence needed for I/O, I think, is mostly strategic. That is, you have to understand the political situation on the ground. You have to understand their societal fault lines. You have to know who the useful idiots are. It's open, it's easy to obtain. It's hard to analyze, but it's easy to obtain. Okay. Both pay a lot of attention to pre-conflict. There's a shaping of the cyberspace environment. You have to maintain access to your targets. You have to identify targets and so on well in advance of when you want to attack them. In the information environment, you have to do a lot of preparation before you actually launch an operation. For example, you want to establish the accounts for the Twitter accounts and whatnot for gaining influence. You want to gain influence and credibility before you start the operation. And you have to participate. You have to persuade people that you're a credible source, that you're a credible party. You want to lay the groundwork so that others can do your dirty work. You think about different kinds of operation in cyberspace. There's cyber attack, cyber exploitation that we all know about. In different kinds of operations in the information environment, you can think about propaganda. This is my own taxonomy. There's nothing particularly original about it, but these are useful things. Chaos production and leaks. Different kinds of operation intended to cause different kinds of effects. And you can think about different ways of protecting. Okay? In cyberspace, I just have I have four categories that are worth talking about here. By the way, I'll send these slides to anybody who wants them. Just send me an email, and I'll be happy to send them. You can avoid, you can detect, you can defend, and you can recover in both cyberspace and in the information environment. All those things on the left you recognize, using the internet less as a way of avoiding doing anomaly detection for detection, for defense, writing more secure code, patching, and the like, recovering, doing backups, and so on. And avoid in the information space for I/O to defend against it. What you can do, you can use social media less. You can avoid untrusted or biased sources. You can, for detection, you have to identify an information campaign against you in progress. You have to recognize it as such. Notice that's really difficult to detect in an environment in which a society is already riven by conflict. Okay? Russians, it's hard for them to create conflict. It's easier for them to amplify existing conflict. Defense, you can do media literacy, fact-checking, and so on. You change business models to inhibit spread of information. All those things are good from a defense standpoint. For recovery, you can issue corrections. You can undertake retrospective attribution. You can try to isolate targets, insulate audiences from each other. I point out one interesting characteristic about this, which I wish I had put on this slide, and I had forgotten about it. For cyber protection, okay, if you want to protect myself in cyberspace, everybody who owns a computer recognizes that at least, wants that computer to be protected. May not take all the right action, but they want to be protected. Okay. Your target audience in the information environment, in information operations, not all of them want to be protected. So as a policymaker, I can make the assumption, if I'm trying to protect people in cyberspace, that every owner of a computer wants that computer protected. As a policymaker, I can't make that assumption about my entire population. Not everybody wants to be protected. And I'll point out that on the right-hand side, many of the items there that I've listed as elements of protection, they involve the person being targeted wanting to be protected. They have to want to be media literate. They have to want to care about facts. They have to want to use social media less. That's the problem, right? So these are some of the thoughts that I have here, and I would love to hear, to engage in a discussion here. So,
thank you very much. And David, let's go straight to you for reflections on what you just said.
Well, first of all, privileged to be back here. Congratulations to the organizers for putting on yet another very, very stimulating endeavor. Herb, that was terrific. Thanks for dressing up for us today. I've never seen you in a jacket before. I was going to compliment you on having a shirt with a collar. I thought that was... and I want to reassure you that I have no PowerPoint slides. I am keenly aware that as a general officer, while on active duty, I was authorized and encouraged to use PowerPoint in exercising my First Amendment free speech rights, but I have sworn off those since retiring. I want to make 2 points, actually, and only the second one is going to comment on what I thought was a very thought-provoking briefing, Herb. The first is actually to reflect a little bit on what we have heard today, because I think that we have to be careful, and I'm talking from a U.S. perspective to a degree here, we have to be careful not to make too much of what seems to be a really revolutionary development in the U.S., where the United States is actually going on the offense, if you will. Yes, Cyber Command has publicly acknowledged, the Department of Defense has acknowledged that they used cyber, if you will, offensive capabilities to disrupt the actions of the Islamic State in cyberspace as an effort to augment or make truly comprehensive the campaign to defeat the Islamic State, which obviously was conducted in so much as the Islamic State as an army was defeated, not the Islamic State as insurgent groups or terrorist elements. We're going to see them emerge, I think, as they've reorganized more worrisomely than may be expected. But they helped take that down, and that was complemented in turn by a kinetic focus on the cyber capabilities of ISIS. They destroyed the Raqqa operational center. Not only did they destroy the servers and switches, but also killed many of the leaders of that entity. And that was a big deal. Task Force Ares, built around, actually General Nakasone commanded at the time the U.S. Army Cyber, which General Hernandez was the first commander of some years ago. That was a very big deal. And then, of course, we've seen the public acknowledgement that Cyber Command used some offensive capabilities to disrupt actions of Russian elements on the eve of our midterm election in 2018. This is obviously not the first time we have used offensive cyber capabilities in the United States. This capability has been around for a while. I can't talk about some of the capabilities that we may have exercised, because if they were at that time, they would have been under what's called covert action authorities rather than Title 50, rather than Title 10, which is Department of Defense military activities. Title 50 being, of course, the CIA covert action authorities. But you can read David Sanger's book about Stuxnet and determine what happened there, and there are some other examples that at least are out in the public realm. And I think, though, that we are not going to see as much offensive activity as, again, people expect. That, the military commanders have always been frustrated that we're not doing more of this. Look, No one knows this better than the guy who commanded the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and Central Command at their height. And it was very, very interesting, the perspective that I had as a commander on the battlefield, where I wanted to see these activities taken down. Why do we allow Inspire magazine, the magazine of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a very, very effective electronic magazine, e-zine, especially because they had American colloquial English-speaking individuals, some actually had US dual citizenship, were the ones who were the editors of this. And then when I became the director of the CIA, I realized that, number one, it's not as easy to take something down and keep it down as I thought it was as a 4-star, even though we had, obviously, all kinds of Title 50 authorities supporting us. I just never sat and worked through, okay, then what, and then what, and then what. And then what, ultimately, is they pop back up, which, by the way, remember, ISIS is still active in cyberspace. We have not defeated ISIS, the cyber caliphate. We have taken away the ground caliphate, not the cyber caliphate. Have we disrupted it at various times? Certainly. But you want to do that, I think, for strategic reasons, maybe operational, but not just constantly, because every time you take it down, you are exposing your methods or possibly your sources and capabilities. And if you understand the value of watching something, and you could say that this is persistent engagement, because that would be an accurate description, you recognize that maybe you don't want to take it down. And maybe there's even this gives you some options if you need to at some point in a very strategic way. There are some, if you can think about this again without getting into details, what this actually gives you the capability to do. And I think, again, that as this evolves, again, much discussion that finally we're on offense, finally we're using these capabilities. We have always had these capabilities. Have we developed them very substantially further by adding the so-called National Cyber Mission Task Force, 133 teams, over 6,000 in total. Some are 30 plus, some are 60. There's different capabilities and organizations. Yes, that is a huge augmentation of American military cyber capability. But look, we've had NSA for decades, and NSA long before this transitioned from being a traditional signals intelligence organization to being arguably the best cyber element in the world, together with certainly the publicly known, the IOC, the Information Operations Center at the CIA. And then when you put together what the CIA can do with its capabilities, that if you can't get in through cyberspace, perhaps there's another way to get in, let your imagination run wild, you can see that this is a very, very substantial capability. And we have had this for some time, but we have always argued with ourselves about what happens if we use an offensive capability and thereby expose it. It's the same as, again, disclosing something that gives up a very valuable source. This is a very valuable capability, a very valuable method. And again, I welcome discussion on this after this, if folks, and I know that we had the Cyber Command J5 in here, but I think we need to be a bit careful, again, in assessing whether this means that we're really now on the offensive all the time in a way that we have not been in the past. Keeping in mind, in the past, if we did do something, it most likely would have been under covert action authorities, which means by definition, by law, you cannot talk about it. I am aware of only one Title 50 covert action ever disclosed deliberately, and that was when President Obama announced the operation that took down Osama bin Laden, which was a covert action for a variety of reasons had it not gone well. And I was a commander in Afghanistan at the time. Otherwise, what we know about those have come from books like David Sanger's or other journalistic endeavors. So that's just one to throw out there, just perhaps to be a tiny bit provocative. With respect to your briefing, Herb, I thought the big idea here, or the light bulb that came on for me, obviously all of this is, you would say is intuitively obvious to the casual observer, as West Point math books used to say, especially when it was not intuitively obvious. The big idea here, I think, is the challenge that this presents to democracies uniquely, and the unique ability it may give to authoritarian governments that wish us ill because of the vulnerability, if you will, and I use quotes, of social media platforms, internet service providers, and so forth, to those who want to do what the Russians did quite effectively in the 2016 elections. That is quite profound. And I think it highlights a very serious conundrum right now for all of societies, but especially, again, for democracies, and especially, frankly, for big democracies like the United States. And that is that we are having a hard time just intellectually keeping up with what's going on in cyberspace and the implications of that, much less actually gathering the support in Congress for legislation. We were talking earlier, remember there was this very least common denominator cybersecurity bill put up by both a Republican chairman of the House Intelligence Committee and his Democratic leader, and that couldn't get through Congress for another 3 or 4 years. So obviously it's way behind the curve when it comes to that. Legislation, we finally in the United States just last fall created something many of us have been calling for some time, which is a cybersecurity, and they call it, it's an unwieldy title, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is under the Department of Homeland Security, which was desperately needed to oversee the most critical infrastructure cybersecurity. And again, much less policies and regulations and all the other, not to mention the capabilities to actually implement what legislation is being established, given the challenges of government attracting enough of the best and brightest in the cyber world, where I think only 2 organizations truly are having the great success in that, and those are arguably NSA and, again, CIA. And yet this is a whole of society debate, because that's what has to be the response. And this is quite significant. I mean, how do we get people to get educated on media consumption, media literacy, I think your slide said. We know that people gravitate to media bubbles. How do we shake them out of that? How do we get social media platforms to get much more on the front foot in addressing the issues that we are seeing emerge, especially when those issues are contrary to their economic incentives. If it's all about clicks, we know from internal leaks from Facebook and elsewhere, we know that they don't take stuff down right away because it's clicking away. It is controversial, it is provocative, and it is, again, supporting their economic model. I tend to think that we need legislation for a number of these areas. I've felt for a long time that extremist content on the internet should have been taken down or should have been made illegal the same way that we made child pornography illegal in the United States. And again, some countries, by the way, are much more agile at this than is the United States. What about, in fact, this current issue that arose just in the last 24 or 48 hours, a very clearly altered video of the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States, which makes her appear drunk or ill or something. How do you distinguish that? And they refuse to take that down, although clearly it is disinformation. And the argument is, well, but then we'd have to take down satirical videos or political cartoons or who knows what. So where do you, this is the kind of debate that should follow from all of this. It is very, very profound because it has a huge impact on our democratic processes, not the least of which are our elections, but it goes way beyond that to influence the influence of society on those who have been elected. I understand that Facebook actually is going to create a Supreme Court type entity to resolve these kind of issues. But presumably it'll have to have one for the EU, one for the US, one for other distinct markets. You can see where this is going. And again, the complexity that I think you highlighted in your discussions is really quite significant. Again, all of us, I think, have been aware of this inside, but that sort of hit us in the middle of the face intellectually, and I think it spurs an awful lot of very, very good reflection and thought.
All right. Thanks a lot, and thanks for bringing in the notion that that undemocratic nations have a clear advantage in information operations.
Well, they don't play by the rules.
Exactly.
If there are such, I mean, there are sort of normally accepted rules, I think, albeit, again, countries do spy on each other, I'm told.
Yes. How would you know? Of course,
I only know what I read in the newspaper, and terrible when it was found, reported according to the newspaper, that the United States was actually eavesdropping on the Chancellor of Germany. I find that hard to believe, but embarrassingly so.
The author of one war in 140 characters, David Patrikaros, was in Tallinn actually last weekend, and we had a discussion in in a literary festival. Where he actually, one of the things he said that if the US would have operated a troll farm somewhere in Delaware, influencing elections in another country, then press would have known about that in 1 week, and next day it will be prosecuted, taken down, and so forth. And of course, the opposite is not the case. But I want to ask you both one question, and this is
not only is it not the case, it apparently was approved by, funded by, and so forth. So,
of course,
again,
by the so-called Kremlin's chef, a guy called Prigozhin. I want to ask you the following question. The NATO nations 5 years ago at the Wales summit declared that cyber attacks can lead to the invocation of a collective defense clause so that we can actually go to war because of a cyber attack. Could you envisage or imagine a situation whereby we will go to war because of information warfare attacks?
I mean, I can imagine it. You can imagine an attack that was clearly attributed to an adversary that took down the entire electrical grid of a major country and caused the effect.
That's an easy, but
so it was a cyber weapon of mass destruction. I mean, that's, I assume, again, this is very easy to make this kind of declaration. It's a little bit more difficult when you get around the table in Brussels and start discussing should we actually invoke Article 5, which, as you know, has only been invoked one time in the wake of the 9/11 attacks.
But what about information operation, which is actually, let's say, crossing the threshold of war?
I think the point here is that under U.S. doctrine right now, the term information operations includes cyber attack. Yeah. But in the way in which I've been trying to talk about it here, I've been using the term, I've been separating cyber attack and information operations in a casual way. The problem is that the terminology here is totally muddled, and I think the intent of your question was in the information operation sense of propaganda and so on. Can one imagine invoking Article 5? And from my standpoint, the answer is no. Attacking election infrastructure by hacking voting machines, perhaps. I point out that Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency in the United States does have responsibility for cyber protection, but not for information operations in the sense that for propaganda, for bad, for misinformation on Twitter and disinformation on Facebook and so on. Doesn't have responsibility for that. In fact, nobody has responsibility for that. So in the sense that you're talking, that I understood your question, no. Impossible to imagine that NATO would invoke Article 5.
I mean, but I think you're implying, hang on a second, you're implying, again, war, I think everyone is immediately leaping to the kinetic definition of war, that we're going to start dropping bombs or we're going to launch missiles or invade or something like that. There are lots and lots of other options that exist short of that, even if you invoke Article 5. Right. And I think the truth is that, again, this is an area in which we're doing what might be termed intellectual low crawling. We're sort of, it's discovery learning. No, we don't know exactly. We haven't thought our way through all this stuff. Despite all the debates, we have not drawn clear conclusions. And I think we have also learned that you should be very careful of declaring red lines or these kinds of very clear thresholds, because if a red line is crossed, you really should have to act on it. And if you do not, that inaction sends shivers around the world as to the credibility of the country or organization that might have established that red line or established the threshold that was breached.
As happened in August 2013, after the Syrian chemical weapons red lines were crossed.
And I can tell you that as far away as Singapore, people pulled me aside and said, this has ramifications out here, not just in the Middle East. And I would contend that it may have had some ramifications in Ukraine and some other places as well. So it's a very, very significant issue. And I think policymakers would be very wise to avoid very clear definitions or very clear red lines, because once they're crossed, something does have to be done.
Maybe just explain for the public that in August 2012, President Obama said that if chemical weapons would be used against the population in Syria, he would reconsider U.S. position in using force in Syria. And then East Ghouta in, I think, 6th of August 2013, the chemical weapons were used with a huge amount of casualties when actually President Obama differed. But I want to open now up to the audience. We have 22 minutes and 7 seconds. And first goes to Lisa. And even if everyone at stage know you, please identify yourself too.
My name is Lisa Past, and I'm currently with the McCain Institute for International Leadership. And I'd like to take 90 minutes of the remaining 22 minutes for a slightly elaborated question. One of the things that you didn't really address much is the adversarial behavior in both information and cyber operations, and in how similar that is in being agile and integrated and opportunistic. Integrating cyber and information operations, lawfare, economic warfare, and all of that during peacetime. Very similar in staying below the threshold of armed attack, and very similar in that all and any tools and targets are legitimate. So knowing what we know about adversarial strategy and in how flexible and agile it is, how can we as rule of law-based nations that have very clear chains of command, which democracy takes time and deliberation takes time, how do we manage risks in a way that's as agile and as flexible as the adversary clearly is?
So basically, how to respond to a full spectrum warfare?
How to train risk management?
My answer to that question is that one of the fundamental guiding principles of certainly the United States and most democracies, I think, is a clear distinction between, quote, war and, quote, peace. And this is an environment in which there are no non-combatants. Especially information, with what I'm talking about as information operations, information warfare, if you will. There are no non-combatants in that. There's a constant battle going on all the time And the entire, I'm most familiar with the US government, the entire structure of the US government is oriented around the distinction between peace and war. And it doesn't do very well in this gray zone. Whereas the adversaries, that it's not accidental in my view that that Russia and China are authoritarian states, and they can do things in this space that we can't. So I don't know how to deal with it, but that's to me the fundamental problem, is how you transform to a semi-war footing, an intermediate stage, where there's conflict all the time, and I don't know how to deal with that.
Dude, I think what you have is a comprehensive toolbox all the time. And by the way, as a member of the board of the McCain Institute, I congratulate you on your affiliation. Look, I think that what you've laid out, again, is very hypothetical, and I have to give a very hypothetical answer because there's no specific to it. But you saw us do this, actually, in the run-up to the 2018 elections, where there was a decision that the risk was too high at the 11th hour, that Russian activity could put a finger on the scales of the election or disrupt them in some fashion. And so all of a sudden we used the capabilities that we had. And by the way, on the Title 10 side, I'm pretty certain, because obviously we talked about it afterwards, which you wouldn't do if it was on the Title 50 side, the covert action side. And we risked exposing our capabilities and potentially some sources and other tools that we had. And that was a case you're just constantly doing risk mitigation. Now, we have also subsequently, subsequent to the 2016 elections, had a variety of punitive trade or economic sanctions imposed. We have used the legal tools and actually, I think, indicted or preferred charges against some of the individuals who were involved. It's going to dramatically reduce their ability to go to many of the countries with whom we have extradition agreements, and on and on and on. And we named and shamed and et cetera. So, by the way, nothing should be taken to infer that I am anything but one who agrees with Winston Churchill that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And I very much want to live where I live. I feel very fortunate to have grown up in a democracy. But I do think we have to recognize that there are some sort of unique vulnerabilities because of our system. I do think that, again, we can react to these. But again, I've been around the Situation Room table in the West Wing of the White House as we debated this kind of stuff. And it usually has to be fairly significant before we're going to do something that is visible. By the way, keep in mind, there are other less visible or invisible activities. Hopefully they stay invisible. They don't always. But in the covert action toolbox, there's an awful lot that can be done as well. And as you think about what you are trying to do, sometimes what you want to dream up is something diabolically clever that they may not know who did it. They know something happened. They don't know precisely who did it. They may think we did it, but they don't actually want to acknowledge that they know that we did it. And we're happy not to have them publicly say that, but there is an effect there as well.
Spoken like a former CIA director.
Well, if you think about how do you respond right now, for example, to Iran, it would be irresponsible if people weren't thinking of that kind of response, as well as the, again, obvious kinetic or very overt activities.
Very good. Gentlemen, you have been both speaking about the vulnerabilities of democratic societies, but there is of course, there are a number of strengths. And
Absolutely.
one is, of course, the very important regulatory power what democracies have because of the huge markets in North America, in Europe, in Japan, South Korea, Australia, and so forth. And David, you were alluding to the need to legislate, to regulate the social media platforms. Herb, when you had your last slide on in terms of protection measures, you actually had as one, I think, first line was use less social media. I don't think this is necessarily going to be the case.
Yes, that's true.
And if you agree with that, what would be the avenue for you to approach actually regulating the social media platforms? Should we consider them to be as utilities, or should we consider them as publishers? What would be the way?
So how do you regulate the social media platforms? This is an interesting question. I'm struck by, in that context, I'm struck by what the general mentioned about pornography. And the more I study disinformation, the more I think it resembles pornography, which is, I know it when I see it. Now, those aren't my words. Those are the words of a Supreme Court justice who struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled to define pornography. And his conclusion was, can't define it, but I know it when I see it. That's a terrible definition to have legally, right? But this is a Supreme Court justice.
It's especially terrible if you are having machines try to identify. This is the problem.
That's right.
Child pornography, actually machines have been able to, over time, reasonably well identify that. It's much more difficult when you get into hate speech, extremist speech. Where is the line that it crosses the incitement to violence? But the social media platforms have done miserably at that. It took public outcry from some very good private organizations to get Anwar al-Awlaki videos taken off of YouTube, by and large. They were more available 2 years ago, I think it was, than they were when he was actually alive. Keep in mind, he was killed in September of 2011 in Yemen, having been judged to be the most dangerous man in the world at the time, along with his sidekick, who was the editor of Inspire magazine at the time. And again, the problem with, I do, again, have some sympathy, certainly, or understanding for the social media platforms on this, except that I think they can do so much, much better. Again, if these private organizations could find this stuff, why could they not with their tens of thousands of employees?
And in fact, they are not government agencies. And so they, in fact, can take down whatever they want, without violating First Amendment rights and so on. So that's absolutely right. The problem is they're not in their economic incentive to do so. They don't have they have the physical means to do it, but they don't want to do it. And they say, we don't want to get into the business of content, of arbitrating truth. Well, why not? The reason is that they will piss off a lot of people for every decision that they make. And they don't want to endure that kind of controversy because it'll hurt their bottom line, and so on. Those are the kinds of issues that you face. And, sort of the idea of a Supreme Court, how long does the Supreme Court take to render decisions? I mean, you're going to get into the onesies and twosies where you have to really be making millions of decisions in a short amount of time. And so there has to be a better way to do this, or I'm praying that there is. I do not know.
Look, I think there is. There has to be a will to implement it. The Christchurch attacks being visible for so long on a variety of different social media platforms was arguably, in quotes, criminal. So again, that has to be done better. By the way, when you think about the strengths of democracies and countries with the rule of law, it's very interesting to reflect that oftentimes the corrupt political figures, the major criminal enterprise leaders seek to invest their money in democracies with the rule of law because they don't want to invest it in their own place. They know how corrupt and criminal it is, and it may not be preserved. One of the paradoxes of life.
Let's go for more questions in the audience.
I see someone in back there.
Oh yeah, yes. Okay. Let's take gentleman in the middle and then to extreme back. Okay.
Yeah, Brad Bigelow from SHAPE, and I have a comment and a question. A couple of years ago, we had a U.S. Analyst from the intelligence community who was specialist in cyberspace, Chinese cyberspace operations and information operations, come and give us a presentation about techniques, tactics, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end, I said, well, this is great, but exactly your question, what do we as democracies operating under rule of law, how do we respond to that? And I keep his response to that question with me at all times when I think about what's going on here right now, which is, and his response was, every time that Russia or China or North Korea or Iran sees 17 different NATO nations come together for a military exercise, sees 29 flags meeting together to take decisions as a consensus body, you at least cause them a moment's pause to say, wait a minute, what are the odds I'm really facing here? Because you can imbalance the situation, but a long-term conflict, the numbers are against them. My question is, we're doing that. We have decades of experience of cooperation in conventional and other force and capability development and deterrence mechanisms. We're starting to do that through this conference and other venues to develop that in cyberspace. Is there an equivalent for information operations that we need to be exploring?
Right.
Let me actually start on that, because I've recently done a monograph on American foreign policy that was titled Coherence and Comprehensiveness, an American Foreign Policy Imperative, and specifically, frankly, with respect to China. The U.S.-China relationship, obviously the most important in the world by far, perhaps more important than all of the others put together at this point in time. How it is resolved, and I'm one who hopes that it can be mutually beneficial, that it can does not have to become more conflictual than it is at present, keeping in mind that the unique aspect of this particular competition, because obviously there are very significant competitive elements, the unique aspect is that we're also among each other's biggest trading partners, something that certainly didn't exist in the days of the Cold War, when we did very, very little exporting or importing to and from the Soviet Union. And what I'm getting at here is the comprehensive approach to this means you employ all tools. And so if you are concerned about, as we have been and continue to be, about theft of intellectual property through cyberspace, you've got to employ all of the tools. And it's taken us a long time to get to that. You had President Obama confront President Xi at the Sunnyland Summit some years back. After quite a significant diplomatic engagement, the Chinese actually responded, and the PLA theft of intellectual property in cyberspace did actually go down demonstrably, until it started to go back up, and more by the MSS, the Ministry of State Security, than the People's Liberation Army, their version of NSA. And so again, we've got to muster all of these comprehensive tools, but the coherent component implies that everything you do around the world has to be examined through a prism that asks, what will the effect of this be on the U.S.-China relationship and on the policy on China from a U.S. perspective, which has to be together with all of our allies and partners. And so you then have to ask about the value of partners, the value of allies in particular, the values of a coherent approach, rather than one that is disrupted by perhaps overstressing of the inadequacy of spending on, as a percent of GDP, on defense or trade issues and the rest. Not that those are not legitimate issues, don't get me wrong, but if you're going to have a coherent approach, and it's going to be comprehensive on top of that, you've constantly got to ask what your actions at the G7 summit or a NATO summit or the bilateral and alliance relationships, how important that is. Because you've put your finger on something, and that is the power of many. And the fact is that some of our most important adversaries right now cannot count true allies for them at all. And in many cases are inspiring others to actually balance against them by again, being parts of alliances and partners. And that is crucially important, and that is something that my own country very much needs to reflect on, I think, because it has to be done together, and you can't disrupt that, even if you have legitimate issues. And I've heard many more than the current president complain to NATO partners about the inadequacies of defense spending.
I think Keir, yes. Keir, are you still on track of having attended every CyCon?
All but one, Sven, all but one.
Ah, you missed one. All right, Keir. Yes.
Keir Giles from Chatham House. General Petraeus pointed out that the information challenges we're facing that Herb laid out are uniquely challenging to democracies, but then there's another thing which is unique to democracies, which is the implied premise of this talk, of this panel, that cyber operations are separate from information operations or can be contrasted with them, whereas all of our adversaries are surprisingly unanimous that it is a single indivisible whole and that dividing cyber off is an entirely artificial construct. So my question, and I'd like to hear from both panelists if possible, is that a self-inflicted conceptual injury which constrains our responses? The fact that we see this division between cyber and information, given that it's historically led to this situation that Herb Lynn described, where we have agencies to protect us in terms of cyber security, but none to protect us up until now in terms of information security. Do you recognize that as a problem? And if so, what would you ideally like to do about it?
Herb, can we start with you?
I have to say that I worry a lot about government action to control the information space, the information environment, in the same way in which the United States would like to control cyberspace. It's very clear that that's what we want, that we would like to try to do that in cyberspace. That's part of declared U.S. doctrine in cyberspace. If the U.S. government came out with a similar comment about the information space, I would be terrified about that. And you know, authoritarian governments have tendencies towards restricting good information, what I would call the good information to the public, to the extent that one believes that there are authoritarian tendencies in certain leaders of certain nations in the West. There might be some concerns about that kind of information control. So, I accept your premise that there's some integration, that the adversaries have an advantage of integration. Whether we should go in that direction is a very much a value-laden question. And I'm worried about going there. I don't know where I come out on it, frankly. Because in the United States, we have a very, if you contrast all the nations in the world on free speech and so on, the U.S. is really at one end of a pole, one end of a spectrum, right? And other nations are, sort of go farther away from that. I don't know how much farther away I want to go from the First Amendment. Which, I'm an American. I really value the First Amendment, but there are some. It's not clear that that's consistent with the sort of world that you're talking about.
I'm not as concerned about that. I am concerned about, again, how do you define First Amendment rights, and I cherish those as I think most Americans do. It's more, again, coming to grips with what should the responsibilities be of those who are presenting these ideas in a world where you no longer have the trusted three network nightly news, which are all trying to be as objective as they possibly can, but you have some that are absolutely very clearly in one side of the camp, one side of the debate, and then another that's on the other side, and then now others that are just purveying, again, what is essentially a niche to which some people can retreat. And I think it's, again, how do we as a society come to grips with that? How does government come to grips with that? How do, again, the very powerful social media platforms and internet service providers come to grips with that, and so forth? There are some definitional issues in here as well, which the military will be more familiar with, in which the U.S. and particularly U.S. military, especially the U.S. Army, has sort of tied itself in knots over about what is I/O? Does it include cyber or not? Where is psychological operations? Except we can't call it that anymore. We call it military information support operations, and these kinds of things, which actually can consume an awful lot of organizational energy as you're trying to sort out, again, your sort of conceptual architecture and then actually the organizational architecture of who has authority, gives orders about this or that. There is some of that certainly in government. Again, as you point out, there actually is a gap in government, just as there was a glaring gap before we had a cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency. Yes, there was an office in Department of Homeland Security, which had that, but it was wholly inadequate to the task, given the concerns that we should have about the, very, very low likelihood of a cyber weapon of mass destruction, but not the impossible likelihood of that, and we should have been much more agile in developing that kind of organization. So again, this comes back to, again, the society. It comes right back to what I guess my original commentary on your, again, very thought-provoking set of slides is, that we've got to have some pretty big debates. Somebody's got to guide those debates, civil society organizations and so forth. Government has to distill some of that. And if anyone saw the hearings with the Facebook founder, especially of the US Senate, you realize that the baseline knowledge is not in all cases at the highest of levels to inform the kinds of legislation. So again, there's going to have to be some assistance even in that regard. There's somebody in the room here, I won't identify by name, but is moving from one major tech organization to the major social media platform. And we were talking earlier about how they might actually help in all of this. And I actually think they ought to be among the ones who are helping to craft legislation to come to grips with the issues that have now surfaced, even if those are contrary to their economic incentives and the sheer money-making capacity of those organizations. Because if they don't do that, I think they're going to undermine they're going to strangle or at least constrict the goose that is laying the golden egg. In the financial world, we often say that we want to do well. Obviously, if you don't do well, people aren't going to continue to invest their money with you, but you want to do that while doing good. And you do that not only because it's the right thing to do, and that should be enough, but if you don't accept that, it's the smart thing to do, because if you don't do good long enough, eventually you're not going to do well. And I hope that that could be the conclusion that is reached after so many of the exposures of the inadequacies and the inadequate responses, again, by the senior leaders of these large organizations.
All right. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, already over time. Unless you have something to say as a closing remarks, please, ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause.
Thank you.